Hello, everyone, and welcome to Food Tank's webinar series. My name is Lonnie Furbank, and I'm a research assistant with Food Tank. I'm really excited about today's webinar with Chris Ely, the co-founder of Applegate, and Michael Berger, the founding partner and vice president of supply chain for Elevation Burger, and also a member of Food Tank's board of directors. Today, their presentation will focus on the history and the future of grass-fed organic beef. This webinar will be recorded and posted on foodtank.com after the session. You can also follow along and participate on Twitter using the hashtag #FoodTank. Throughout the webinar, please submit your questions using the Questions tab in your control panel, or you can email them to Lonnie, L-A-N-I, .Furbank, F-U-R-B-A-N-K, @gmail.com. So without further ado, Chris and Michael, it's truly an honor to have you here today, and we're looking forward to your insights. I'll turn the floor over to you both now.
Thank you, Lonnie. Hi, all. This is Michael Berger. I'm joined by Chris Ely, and today we'll be speaking about the past, present, and future of grass-fed and organic beef. Real quickly, as Lonnie mentioned, I'm one of the founding partners of Elevation Burger, and I've run our supply chain since the company's inception about 8 years ago. We are, for those that don't know us, we are a fast casual burger restaurant. Burger, fries, and a drink are about $10. We serve exclusively organic proteins, organic grass-fed beef, organic chicken, and an organic pork bacon. Our buying program is the largest organic protein supply chain of any restaurant group in the United States. And we are continuing to grow. By the end of the year, we should have around 65 restaurant locations. We're based in the Washington, D.C. metro area, which is where our heaviest presence of locations is, with currently 16 in this market. And Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris Ely. I'm glad everybody's joining us today. So I'm the co-founder of Applegate, which we started back in 1986. So for over 30 years, we've been producing further processed natural and organic meats. This business was actually started by my dad back in 1941, and we used to process all the local farmers' meats here in Hunterdon County, New Jersey. So this is the nice part of New Jersey. I've since retired, but still staying active in the business, in the organic meat business. I sit on a board for another organic meat company in Australia, and work closely with Michael on some projects down in Washington, D.C. So Michael, why don't we get this going, and we'll take it from there.
Excellent. So one of the things I think that's an important distinction right off of the bat, and Chris, I'll turn it over to you, is the grass-fed and organic. And it's important to understand the distinction between the two. So, Chris?
Well, grass-fed is pretty straightforward when you talk 100% grass-fed. I grew up on a grass-fed farm. My granddad only knew how to grass feed, and what it meant was that all of our animals were born on the range. They lived their entire lives on the range, and directly from the range went to the slaughterhouse for further processing. So that they never were finished on the grains of any kind. They were not put into feedlots of any kind. They were allowed to practice their natural behaviors by being out on pasture. So that's the big distinction between that and so much of the beef which is sold here in the United States and consumed, which is your feedlot beefs, where the cattle may start on grass but are finished on grains in a controlled feedlot, of where they're not allowed to forage other than the grains that they're fed to fatten them up and to marbleize the meat.
And an important distinction for organic cattle is, and we'll go into this a little bit later as we further explore the definitions, but organic is a certified and audited term that's run by the United States Department of Agriculture under their Agriculture Marketing Service Program. in the National Organic Program sector of AMS. Certified organic cattle tend to be grass-fed. We at Elevation Burger source a 100% grass-fed cattle that would meet the definitions of what Chris just went through. But it's important to understand that not all 100% grass-fed cattle are organic, and not all organic cattle are 100% grass-fed. But there are additional standards under the organic program that are important to understand for cattle. Cattle in the organic program can never be administered antibiotics in order to qualify as a certified organic cattle animal. That, though, does not mean that the animals will not be given antibiotics if they get sick. The program suggests first homeopathic remedies, and if those are not successful in treating the illness, that they are to be administered antibiotics, because that is an animal welfare standard. And they will then be removed from the herd and not sold as an organic cattle. Organic cattle must be free roaming on pasture for the entirety of a grazing season. Grazing seasons can vary by region and geography. Some of the locations where we're sourcing our beef 365 days a year qualifies as grazing season, and those animals would be out on pasture for the entirety of the grazing season. In other areas, during non-grazing season, they would be brought inside and they would be given silage, which is feed. It could be a hay, and grain combination, alfalfa, etc. All of that feed, though, would be required to be a certified organic product under the agriculture and under the NOP standards for those products. So why is grass-fed and organic beef? Why grass-fed and organic beef? There's a variety of reasons, and we'll go through some of them now. Chris?
Well, let's start with animal welfare. You know, the good thing about beef, they're probably one of the most hardy species out there of protein that humans consume. They virtually never need any form of medication. So when you're putting an animal out on grass and you give them all the proper space and you properly rotate pastures, they will remain healthy. They might get, there are injuries occasionally out there. Animal gets caught in fencing or they step in a hole they shouldn't. And that would be the few times that they would need any sort of medication tending to. But otherwise, to do what they do naturally, being a ruminant animal, to graze, and of course their systems, their intestinal systems are set up just for grazing, not to be fed a constant diet of corn, which is why they tend to have to use antibiotics, because there creates an imbalance in their system and the animals tend to get sick. So it's a real animal welfare issue to remain out on grass the entire time. You're going to go into non-GMO there, Michael?
Sure. And so, by virtue, grass pasture is non-GMO. It's a naturally occurring species in nature. And so these animals that are 100% grass-fed are exclusively eating those grasses. Under the organic program, part of the requirement to certify a feed, if an animal is receiving certain silage during non-grazing season, when it's a sheltered animal, the National Organic Program does not allow for any GMO or GMO byproducts in feed. Chris, you want to talk about antibiotics?
So, one of the big things when you're doing either organic beef and or grass-fed beef is, as I said earlier, they're very, very hardy species. They really kind of take care of themselves. And it is not necessary in any way to have to medicate cows, beef, except if they should have, and it's more of injuries than anything. And occasionally for the beef cows, the mothers, they may get mastitis on a rare occasion, but that's not general because of being out on the range. So the responsible use of antibiotics, of course, organic, you can never use any antibiotics except if it's the only system that will take care of any disease or illness they may have. So therefore, they would come off the program. So when you have a feedlot and you're feeding these animals constant corn, which is the typical feed given in feedlots, it changes the pH of their digestive system, and they tend to be more susceptible to illness, which will then, because they're all jammed together in a feedlot, tends to run through the herd. Hence, they will give them a constant low-level feeding of antibiotics. They also do it because it does help promote growth, the antibiotics. Absolutely unnecessary when you do grass-fed.
Right. It's a condition known as acidosis that occurs in their rumens. And responsible antibiotic use is something, I just want to pause for another second and say one or two more thoughts on. About 80% of antibiotics that are administered in the United States are running through our livestock system. And for those that have been paying attention to the current events over the last couple of weeks, you've probably seen some front page headlines about a new bacteria that's been discovered recently here in the United States for the first time. It had been discovered previously in China as well as Europe, I believe. And that's something that is a growing public health concern. And there are direct ties to a lot of these antibiotic-resistant bacteria that are coming out of our generally accepted livestock practices in the United States for feedlot raising. Briefly to nutrition, and one thing it's important for me to note that I am not a nutritionist, a dietitian, nor a medical doctor, but there is recently emerging evidence and research that grass-fed beef, particularly grass-fed beef, is a better source of nutrition than conventional corn and soy raised beef. There are higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids, which are the fatty acids you hear touted frequently for salmon and other fish. There are higher concentrations in grass-fed beef when compared to a corn-fed or grain-fed animal. It's also in a better balance to the omega-6 fatty acids, which are some of the more problematic fatty acids. In terms of flavor, Chris, do you want to go into that?
Sure. There's absolutely no question that you're going to have two different tasting beefs, corn-fed versus grass-fed. Your corn-fed, because you get more fat in it and more marbling, you tend to get more of a fatty, buttery flavor out of the beef, which a lot of people seem to like. Grass-fed, because there is less marbling, there's less fats in it, you get a much stronger beef flavor. Some people may or may not prefer that beef flavor. I personally grew up on it. I much prefer that beef flavor and taste beef versus taste butter. If I want to taste butter, I can always slather a little herb butter on top of my steak after I cook it to get that same sort of effect.
Mm-hmm. And that's an important point. In the nutrition, it is a lower fat, particularly when you look at the primal cuts, your strip steaks, your ribeyes, your fillets. It's a lower fat item as compared to a corn-raised animal, as well as lower in saturated fats. In terms of environment health, I'll just touch on two pieces of that. Again, I'm not in the field of climate or environment, but being exposed to this a lot and being with some of the researchers who are close to that information, there are environmental benefits for raising grass-fed cattle over that of feedlotted cattle, particular to the fact that they are grazing on grass pasture. Grass pasture does a better job of sequestering carbon dioxide than does cornfields, and so whereas oftentimes grass pasture are eliminated to make way for cornfields, these animals are grazing on a substance in nature that helps remove carbon from the atmosphere. Secondly, there are water runoff issues in concentrated animal feeding that are not present in grass pasture feeding. When you put the animals together in a very small location, particularly on a hard surface, whether it be concrete or packed down mud, there's quite a bit of runoff from the manure and waste of the animals, and that requires waste mitigation plans for these feeding environments, and oftentimes that can leach into the water system. It is also one of the places where some of these antibiotic-resistant bacteria are living, is in these waste lagoons, and these waste lagoons can and sometimes are utilized as fertilizer water for neighboring produce farms, and that is so one of the ways in which these antibiotic-resistant bacteria are entering our food stream. So what is the history of grass-fed and organic beef? Chris, you want to talk to grass-fed?
Sure. So the reality is that America has been doing grass-fed beef since we first brought cattle to the U.S. It was the way it was done, just like it says there on the slide. And we went into our feedlots, for which we're going to get into the next slide on the real details of it, because we wanted to change how we did food in general in the United States. The other reason grass-fed and organic beef are so important is in the National Organic Standard Program, there is the definitions of how animals are to be raised, and they tend to, all of the standards are set up to try to propagate the natural behavior of animals. And it is natural for the cattle to constantly be foraging and grazing. It is not natural to just spend a diet of corn and other grains for speeding up how they will grow cattle, because they can grow cattle in less than 12 months at much more weight than we can when we grass feed. And grass feeding will take a minimum of almost 2 years to bring an animal to its natural weight for to go to market. So a lot of that has to do with also cost. It is much cheaper to grain feed these animals. So that's kind of like the history of where we have come with our grass-fed.
Mm-hmm. And then the National Organic Program, again, remembering that not all 100% grass-fed animals are organic, and vice versa. The National Organic Program was a program that was established in the mid-90s or early 90s and implemented in 2002 as the National Organic Program. Prior to that, you actually were not allowed to market or label beef as organic beef. The protein approval entity for labeling inside of USDA, known as FSIS, that every retailer who packages meat to go to mass market must go through, would not approve the term organic in front of meat. Prior to the establishment of the program in 2002. So it's a fairly new phenomenon, and it's a fairly new marketed product, organic beef. It is currently of organic, when you look at the pie of organic, about 5% of our food economy currently in the United States, excuse me, in the United States is organic. There are some very big leaders in there. Produce makes up around 13% or so of the produce market. Organic produce makes up about 13%. Dairy is around 10% organic versus conventional. Proteins, which would be chicken, beef, pork, are only about 0.4%. So it's a very small market, and that's why I think it's a very important conversation for us to be having and to enable the growth of that market. Excuse me. So when did changes in livestock farming practices occur, and how and why? If, as Chris said, this was just the way that we did it. Chris, do you want to speak to kind of the first couple of points there?
Sure. So we come off World War II, and all of our soldiers come home to the U.S., and as you know, we have that whole generation of baby boomers, of which I'm one. And we were, we had really established ourselves in the world as a leader in not only militarily, but the world was now looking up to us to be the, the leaders of the world. And just about in the early 70s, we had a Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, who was under the Nixon administration, and he decided that as part of this new leadership that America had, we had to really raise the cheapest food in the world and an unlimited supply. And one of the first things he did was to change how America grew corn. And he literally changed us from an oil-based economy to a corn-based economy. Your corn yields that you get today are not because it's genetically modified corn. It's strictly because of farming practices. They went from 3-foot distances of rows in corn to, in some instances, 12 inches. And so your yields went up just because they concentrated more corn in the fields. And it was just to grow corn, corn, corn. This way we could create such cheap feed, not only to feed humans, but to feed the animals. And it changed the whole way our diet became. I mean, if you look at most of what you see today in the stores, there is some form of corn in the food we eat, whether it's high fructose corn syrup, or it's dextrose, or it is corn chips, and also the meat we eat, if it's not organic, is being fed these big diets of corn. Mm-hmm. Some of that. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna piggyback on that, and it's interesting to understand the mechanism that Secretary Butz used in order to promote that level of production. Excuse me. Up until that time, the policy on subsidies, and this is generalizing the subsidies, they're very complicated and have changed even since his times drastically. But his approach was, rather than paying farmers for keeping commodity products off the market, so if you produced a lot of corn and the market didn't need it or want it, and you bringing that product to market was going to lower the overall market price, they would pay you to keep that corn on the sidelines. Earl Butz changed that dynamic where he said, bring it all to market, let's produce as much as we can, and when the market price dips, we will offer you a subsidy in form of a direct payment, which is now not as much in existence, but a direct payment to make up that gap in between production market price and what you were going to be selling it for at a lower market price. As Chris said, so that led to this overproduction of corn, and today soy is also in that mix, and we were left figuring out as a country what to do with it. And that is largely where the high fructose corn syrup industry, as well as the cattle feed industry, emerged from. And today we've had continued population growth. So, as much as this presentation is a focus on the virtues of grass-fed and organic farming, there is something to be said for how we've industrialized our agriculture. We are capable now of feeding our population on beef, and cheap beef at that. Prior to World War II and earlier, beef was a very luxury item, and it wasn't something that you would eat every day, and when you did, it was expensive. And we've been able to lower that. The fast food industry has continued to promulgate that industry and support that industry as its main goal is to bring food to the masses at a value price or a cheap price. And the way that they do that, one of the ways that they do that is by accessing cheaper beef that's coming off of these industrial farms. So what is the landscape of the current marketplace for organic and grass-fed beef? Chris, you want to talk a little bit about small-scale, large-scale users?
Sure. So your small-scale users are a lot of your little local restaurants that are supporting local agriculture. So they may work closely with a farmer to raise some pigs or beef or whatever they may be doing. Then you get into your large-scale users, which are going to be the Elevation Burgers, the Applegates of the world. Recently, Chipotle had switched over to 100% grass-fed beef. You have Costco, who is doing grass-fed programs. Kosher Whole Foods and such. So these are, some of the examples of who your users are.
And I would be remiss not to point out, because I'm good friends with the woman who runs food quality for Panera, that one of the least marketed attributes of Panera is all of their beef is also grass-fed. And of course, you're at your farmers markets, product that's not going to be labeled for larger consumer sale. And how is this done? When we're talking about the feedlotting, the industrial agriculture here in the United States, where is a lot of this product coming from? Well, it's largely an international supply chain. You've got Uruguay, Australia, New Zealand, who are some of the largest producers of grass-fed and organic beef in the world. Then you also have, getting market access soon to the United States, will be Ireland, who has grass-fed beef. Brazil has quite a bit of grass-fed beef. They currently cannot sell raw beef into the United States, though. It's a trade issue. And same with Argentina. Argentina has a large supply of grass-fed beef as well, but they don't currently have the United States market access. But it's a very international supply chain. One of the things to point out is we've been good at forcing certain components of agriculture in the United States that we may or may not necessarily have been predisposed to be able to do. And the industrial livestock system is one example of that. The countries that were just named, their landscape, their geography, their climate is very predisposed to raising cattle in this way. As I speak, I frequently remind people there seems to be a near and dear association with U.S. beef, but I would like to remind people, you've probably never eaten a banana that's been grown in the United States. And so kind of moving into the next slide, we'll talk about how do we grow the market. This international, I want to make sure I'm keeping an eye on the time, because I know we want to make sure we leave plenty of time for Q&A. One of the most interesting facets, I think, of the current marketplace is what I would call hidden supply. Did you know, and some of you may, that at any given time of year, between 15 and 40% of McDonald's domestic beef that is served in their restaurants is coming from Australia and New Zealand? Most, if not all of that, is grass-fed beef. However, McDonald's does not have an operating system by which they separate that meat out before it is ground with other product. And secondly, and this leads into kind of the consumer demand piece, they don't necessarily have the consumer that is demanding that wants to pay the premium for it. So you have a lot of this grass-fed product that's entering the conventional market at conventional rates, whereas in the future, ideally, that will be segregated out and brought to market in its actual quality with higher premiums. Consumer demand is, I think, as I said, it's a little iffy right now on that product, at 0.4% for organic, and a small percent also for grass-fed. There's not a tremendous amount of consumer demand for the product right now. That's also one of the reasons I think you don't see Panera out there touting that as one of their #1 leading messages. And growing the market. Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about consumer awareness? You and I had a good dialogue on this before we got onto the formal call.
Yeah, so consumers don't, and that's one of the reasons of today's talk, totally understand the difference between grass-fed and feedlot or grain finished. A lot of that is they've not had good grass-fed beef. They also do not know how to cook it properly, nor do a lot of chefs. If you go down to South America, they really know how to cook a grass-fed beef. You don't sear it at the extreme high temperatures we tend to do with our beef. With all that fat marbling, the beef can take that extreme pressure. You can't do that to true grass-fed beef, that you must grill it at a much lower temperatures, much more gentle temperatures. So they will cook a rare steak more, maybe take 45 minutes to cook a rare steak, whereas we can do it in 10, 15 minutes. And by gently cooking it, it stays very, very tender. So a lot of that is just a misconception or not well educated on grass-fed beef.
And as you and I talked about, Chris, there is some bad grass-fed beef out there.
Yeah.
Not everybody knows how to be a pasture farmer, and if you've read Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma, you'll encounter a gentleman named Joel Salatin, and Joel will tell you that his primary job as a farmer is to be a pasture farmer, that in soil, and that's what's leading to the farming of the livestock and the produce, and so you have to have good pasture that the cattle are grazing on as well.
And that makes the beef seasonal. Your pastures are best in the spring and summer, and the beef coming off that is going to be much better. It's no different than vegetables. When strawberries, we're right now in strawberry season, and the strawberries are fantastic around where we are here in New Jersey, but the rest of the time of year they're miserable because they're coming from California or Florida, and they tend to pick them green, not fully ripe, and you never really get that lovely strawberry flavor. Well, that's true with beef. I mean, it used to be a seasonal product because it was better certain times of years than others, and we don't always look at our food to be seasonal, and I think that's been another issue with the consumer awareness.
Mm-hmm. And I'm gonna. Chris, if you don't mind, I'll just very quickly kind of hit on the rest of these.
Sure.
I want to get to the next slide because the next slide is the barriers to growing the market, and I think we're speaking to a group of folks that are very active in the agriculture industry and very interested in influencing change, and so I want to make sure that we're able to share those thoughts with you so that you can share those thoughts with others. Mentioning back to the previous slide, the comfort with international sourcing, kind of the banana example, there's something near and dear about USA beef, which I'm very national centric as well. I love this country. We're a wonderful country, but there's just some things that we're not the best at the world in doing. Grass feeding cattle at the moment happens to be one of those things. There are some very good farmers here that are doing it. When I speak to that, I'm mostly speaking at the ability of scale and doing it for large users. The industry needs to also be good stewards of creating this consumer awareness and driving the information to the consumer so that they know what to demand. Large user adoption is another facet that we can grow the marketplace by additional consumer exposure, by putting pressure on the supply chain. If, say, a McDonald's were to commit to grass-fed beef tomorrow, they would largely change the beef industry globally, much in the way that you saw Walmart change the dairy industry several years back by eliminating added hormones to their milk products. And then government policy, and I will just say government policy because there's a whole lot around that, and there are many, many places to kind of go at how to improve the agriculture system by way of government policy. Being here in Washington, D.C., having nothing to do with government, but being friends with people in government, I do always want to put a plug in that pointing at the government is not always the solution, particularly here. They need to rise up and help and certainly change as modern agriculture has changed. But at the same time, some of government's role is to respond to consumer and business demand. And one of the things that we can do on this call together, and what everybody can do that you talk to about this, is to drive demand with your wallet, which will ultimately lead to influencing government policy. And that's not to give them a pass. There's things they need to be doing now, but we can put additional pressures to make things change faster. Consumer demand, I think we've kind of beat that one. Chris, I'll poke at special interest in kind of industrial agriculture, and then why don't you take cost and land and organic feed, and we'll close out the closing thoughts and then open it to Q&A.
Sure.
So with regards to special interest, these are groups, and I'm naming them just by name, not singling them out. But you have groups such as the Cattlemen's Association, the Corn Growers Association, the Pharmaceutical Association, the Chemical Association, which is responsible for pesticides. Many of these organizations have economic interest that is tied up in how it is that we raise our livestock in the United States, right or wrong. They're there to represent an industry and to represent their constituents, and that is their role, and their job is to protect that aspect of farming. Industrial agriculture kind of plays into the special interest. There's a lot of infrastructure capital in the United States that has been deployed over the last 50 years that has set us in our ways of raising animals this way, and it is an economic formula that works for them, and tweaking it hard, turning the ship fast, could really crush that industry. And in many ways, we need that industry until we have an alternate solution. So, as I single those two aspects out, please know it's not to castigate them. It's to just highlight it as something for us to pay attention to as we go forward in growing this market.
So in cost, it definitely costs more to raise an animal being grass-fed, and even more so if it's also organic. Now, part of that cost, a big part of it, is the cost of land. Also the cost of the animal. When you look into conventional feedlot beef, you've bought your weaner, the young feeder cow, and generally most people will buy them to finish them. Most don't do a complete from start to finish, versus grass-fed they will. So you'll buy the feeder, you put it in your feedlot, you have your money invested in that, and you want to turn that money over as quickly as possible. Hence, you'll try to get the most weight out of that animal in the quickest part of time that you can. So they'll get a conventional cow or a beef cow up to about 1,200 pounds before they send it off to the slaughterhouse, and they can do that within 12 months or less. When you have your grass-fed animals, you might get them up to 800 or 900 pounds. That's their natural weight gaining ability, and it may take you up to 2 years or more to get to that weight. So you have your money tied up for 2 years. You're also giving them a lot more space out on the range. Depending on the time of year and where you are geographically, it can be anywhere between 5 acres per animal to up to 20 to 50 acres per animal, as you might see out in Australia in some areas where they raise beef. So your cost of land really plays into that, and you might need tens of thousands of acres to raise the same amount of beef as one can do on maybe 100 acres. So that plays into a big part of the cost.
And I want to offer, before we run to the concluding thoughts and open it to Q&A, I just to provide an optimistic perspective, though, on that cost barrier. I want to share some numbers that I actually went over this morning with our franchisees on a phone call directly from Elevation Burger, and my attorney would not be pleased with me if I didn't tell you that this is not a franchise representation by giving you our economics. This is food for thought. If you are a big user and you do have control over your supply chain from the farm to the back door of the restaurant in the way that we do and the way that Applegate would and other large users, you can solve for that cost problem as well as utilizing other product mix besides the grass-fed beef, the more expensive beef. So just to share with you, this is based on SEC filings from 2015 for some public companies. Cost of goods is a measurement of your success in a supply chain in the restaurant world. It's the percentage of expenses that you have against your top line revenue for all the costs that are sold in your restaurant food. Cost of goods. Chipotle in 2015 ran 33.9% cost of goods. Shake Shack ran 32.2% cost of goods. McDonald's ran 33.6% cost of goods. Panera ran 32.6% cost of goods. At our flagship corporate restaurant, we ran 30.29% cost of goods. So we are beating our peers and beating our peers with a higher quality organic meat. So quickly, since I have the mic, just a couple of concluding thoughts, and then Chris for you, and we'll open it to Q&A. Hopefully this has been information, some of which you knew. Hopefully some we were able to share that you didn't know. I'm a fervent believer in grass-fed and organic product. Both products, not just organic. It's for a variety of reasons we discussed today. It's a wholesome product that has the ability to impact planet, human, and animal health. And I think it's something that's very important for us to all go forward and be good stewards of the message and see how it is that we can positively impact the livestock industry.
So, quick thought on my concluding thought on my end is I've been a huge advocate, always have been, for grass-fed beef. Having grown up on a grass-fed farm, I know the difference in flavor. I appreciate the difference in flavor. I think it's a much better eating experience when you can get your good quality grass-fed and you know how to cook it right. And I just think it's the most humane way to raise these animals. When you see them out on the range, and you just can see the peacefulness of the animals. As Dr. Temple Grandin always talks about vocalization, when you're in the feedlot, there's so much noise going on because the animals are stressed and not happy. You just see a totally different scenario out in the pastures, just quiet and enjoying their lives. I just think it's the best way to go for any animal.
Thanks, Chris. And with that, Lonnie, we'd like to open it up to question and answer. And I'm sorry we took up a good chunk of the time, so hopefully we can still have some good Q&A.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thank you, both Chris and Michael. That was a really enlightening presentation, and we do have a lot of questions from our listeners. So I'd like to start with one from Vicky, who, in light of the fact that you guys talked about the increased cost and why of grass-fed and organic beef, so it obviously can be more in the supermarket, up to maybe twice as much. So how does the average consumer or a lower income person fit that into their budget to become a consumer of grass-fed and organic beef?
That is an excellent question. I think that was one of our purposes for starting Elevation Burger. Is we saw that discrepancy in where grass-fed or organic meat or even products in general were sold and consumed. And so, one of the things we're trying to do is proliferate that through a more fast food style environment where we are very competitive with our peers. We're still not as inexpensive as McDonald's. It's a tough question because the product is on the market at the prices that it's on the market. Sometimes you can access product at farmers markets for lower rates because there's not quite as much operational overhead in bringing that to market. So I do occasionally see some ground organic beef that's available. Grinding organic beef is ground beef is a little more accessible than the primal cuts. Costco and Wegmans have very strong programs in ground organic grass-fed beef that does get closer to a conventional price. It is still certainly not at parity, but I would suggest probably looking at ground meat first from perhaps wholesale or warehouse suppliers. Go to Elevation Burger. Chris, I don't know, any thoughts for you?
Yeah, I think part of the problem people when they try to compare cost of a conventional meat or even other foods versus organic and grass-fed is that organic tends to be based on a cost, production cost plus for the farmer. So the farmer gets paid a fair price all the time. Call it fair trade. When you have conventional beef or any conventional meat out there, it's what the market is saying you should, the cost of that meat is costing. So, because there might be an oversupply right now of chicken, for example, which there is being done out there. So the cost of chicken is lower than what it actually costs to raise that animal. So the farmer isn't being paid fairly. They're always being paid fair on an organic system. Should be, most people are being paid fairly on an organic system. So you're seeing the true cost of what it is to raise that beef. So I think that's one of the reasons you see different. I think also we need to learn how to use other cuts of beef and not always run to the strip steak and the ribeye. Ground beef is one, but you have a whole chuck where there are some much less expensive cuts that can be cooked and used in some really good ways and still give a very nutritious, very flavorful meal to any consumer.
Mm-hmm. Last thought is even though I don't think I can give you, it's a great question, and unfortunately the straightforward answer is not that you can go find it for the same price now, but to give you hope for the future, look at things like organic baby carrots versus conventional baby carrots. They have reached pretty much identical cost at the grocery stores, and that took time. And that was based on production outputs, market demand, etc. But there is hope for the future for the products to grow closer to parity in price when you look at some of the other examples out there in the organic produce world.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And we have another question from Zach, who wants to know what consumers should specifically look for on labels, like certifying organizations or things like that, to know that their beef is truly grass-fed and organic as opposed to just a marketing tool.
Chris, why don't you have more experience with the
Yeah, that's kind of a tough question because thanks, Michael. Because the USDA standard on 100% grass-fed is still slightly loose. They do allow the beef not to be totally grass-fed.
It's also not
agencies. You're one that is very adamant that you would see. Well, actually, there are two. Excuse me. There's AWI, who the Animal Welfare Institute, and their whole program is based on things being pasture raised. So if you're seeing anything under AWI certification, I'd say that's an excellent choice. The other is the GAP program that is out there, the Global Animal Partnership. When you start seeing step 4 and above, then they're 100% pasture raised. Step 2 and step 1, they can be feedlot. Certified Humane doesn't, and it's an excellent, excellent certifying organization, does not promote that the beef needs to be 100% grass-fed. But it will be truly well humanely raised under Certified Humane.
Okay.
That's a great question, Zach, because it's a gap not just in beef, but it's a gap in mostly all product other than organic, which is supported and enforced by USDA. So it's an excellent question, and I think that's one of the challenges I think that rightly could be put to government is for more transparency in our agriculture system.
Okay, great to know. And then we'll close out with one final question from Katie. She wants to know, in terms of limiting the environmental impact from livestock, which you guys addressed a little bit, do you see reducing consumption or switching to entirely grass-fed and organic as the right solution to really minimize impacts?
Well, I'm gonna take that and just say that when you are pasture-based, there's a whole synergy that goes on in a properly pasture-based system, because you're not just doing a monocrop. And conventional farming promotes monocrop farming. So a guy is growing corn on corn on corn every year and not rotating and have a diversity on the farm. And that's true with animals in conventional, because they're doing the feedlot, so there's no diversity, and they're just concentrating on one thing. If you're doing a sustainable organic farm where you're raising beef, you're also going to be raising other things, because you need to use that synergy that different animals and different crops will give you. So with the pasture rotation, you are thinking of constantly having the grasses replenish themselves, so you're moving the animals around. You're thinking about what you're planting in the fields. Do you have legumes? You're planting clover and rye grasses and fescues, and making sure that you have a diversity. So it is a far more sustainable system than what most farmers today are planting. As my grandfather once said, those GMOs were created for farmers who shouldn't be farming. And I think that really kind of defines getting into organic farming these days, is to have a diversity.
Okay, wonderful. And before we wrap it up, do either of you want to add anything about where the missions and the future plans of both Applegate and Elevation Burger fit into the future of grass-fed and organic beef?
For Elevation Burger, our plan is to continue growing. As a fast casual restaurant, we have the ability to grow in much higher numbers than just 60 restaurants, and that is our plan. And we have a firm commitment that we will not deviate from in using 100% organic grass-fed beef, whether we're 60 restaurants or 1,000 or more restaurants. And so our commitment is as strong, if not stronger today than it was when we founded the company, to continue offering grass-fed and organic beef. I forget the questioner's name, but the first question kind of addressing cost of product, that's one of our big missions, is to make this a product that's accessible to more and more folks, because just because you you may not have access to or as much money as somebody who shops at a Whole Foods. That does not mean that you should not have access to product that is becoming more and more each day generally accepted as a higher quality nutrition product, a better animal welfare product, and something that's going to have an impact on environment health.
As for Applegate, I've been retired for over a year now from the company, but I do know that they still advocate, always had 100% grass-fed beef. So all the beef that Applegate has used. I do know that there is more and more advocacy going on of trying to get more grass or pasture-fed pork. There's a great difficulty in that. Just worldwide, there's a huge shortage of pasture pork, and there's such a high demand. The largest system in the North America right now figures it's going to take them 5 years, and this is a network of growers for pasture pork. It's going to take them at least 5 years, and they're going to need millions of dollars to expand such a thing. So, it is. I know that it's something that's important for Applegate, but there are a lot of barriers or roadblocks that are preventing it to become 100% in everything that they do. But I know that it's something that they're always trying to work towards.
Got it. Well, once again, thank you both Chris Ely and Michael Berger for joining us today. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in and for sending in your questions. It was truly a pleasure talking with you all today. Food Tank's next webinar will be on Wednesday, June 15th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time with founder and chief food genius of the nonprofit Food Literacy Center, Amber Stott. And you can register for that event now on foodtank.com. Thank you again to everyone, and have a great rest of your day.